I'm happy to introduce you to the second speaker, Cédric Patin, a maître de conférence at l'Université de Lille in France. His research focuses on the interface between prosody and syntax, prosody and information structure, and also areas such as accents, intonation, and segmental realizations, particularly in Bantu languages. He has extensively been working on Shingajija, a Bantu language in the Comoro Island. He also works on the prosody of French. I met Cédric when I was still a PhD student, actually. We were attending the annual meeting of the French Network of Phonology, RFP, in 2005, actually. So that's more than 15 years ago. Since then, we've been meeting in conferences and also working together, and also trying to understand some more phenomena that happens in the Bantu phonology and Bantu linguistics in general. So it's good to have you at the ICU-LINC series today. And Cédric will talk about domains as tools for analyzing the tone-intonation interface. Go ahead.
Thank you, Seunghun. Thank you, everybody at ICU was involved in the preparation of this series, Yukki, Miyu, and Michinori, and everybody. And thank you all for attending this talk. I will now share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody sees my screen.
Yeah, we can see it, yeah.
Great, thank you. The idea lands in the question on how to account for the interaction between tones and intonation. And it's quite difficult. In a seminal paper, Hyman and Monaca discuss this relationship and said that there are three main kind of relations. Accommodation, where the lexical tones have very little interaction with the intonational tones. Submission, where the intonational tones override the lexical tones. And avoidance, where the lexical tone this time overrides the intonational tones. And it's not easy to account for all these kind of possible relationships that sometimes co-occur in a given language. Sorry. An idea that was submitted in a paper by Baldoria and colleagues in 2010 says that we can put the lexical tones and intonational tones on two different layers, on two different tiers. It was built on Boshi, Bantu language of Congo. And what is said, it's my translation, is that the boundary tones of Boshi are different from the lexical or grammatical tones. They are not realized on the same levels. They are superimposed, the boundary tones on the lexical tones. And this leads to various outputs afterwards. They provide examples like the one you have here on this slide. And you can see that in addition to the lexical tones on the first layer here, on the first tier, you have below another tier for boundary tones, and they combine together. So a boundary H tone combining with a lexical tone give you pitch rise, sharp pitch rise. And on the opposite, when you combine low tone, B here stands for low, with a lexical high, you will have something like mid or just lowered high tone. And this way of representing things was very influential, and it was used for the representations. I'm not saying it was used as for the analysis, but it was used in Downing and Rialan book. Seunghun and I were lucky to be part of, where you have a representation that I reformulated in one. So where you have the intonational tone and the lexical tones that are on different tiers. So the idea in this talk is to explore an alternative way of representing things with a notion that is called the domain, the high tone domain, that was proposed in various papers by Kisburst in the 90s. And you can have an idea of what it is. So if you have several syllables, you will have syllables that will be the sponsor, and everything that will be in the domain of the feature will possibly be able to express that feature. But you can have constraints that leads to you to only express the feature on one of these syllables. So in the first part of this talk, I will give you some backgrounds on Shingazija, the language I will mostly use as always, and the optimal domains theory. In the following section, I will discuss the relationship between tone and intonation in the autosegmental perspective and in the domain perspective. And in the third section, I will discuss a specific case study, the yes-no questions in Shingazija. And in the last part, I will briefly discuss other languages. Okay. So Shingazija is a Bantu languages of Comoros, as Seunghun said in the introduction. It's one of the 5 Comorian languages. It's spoken near Mozambique, basically. The data I use in the following slides come from a very long history of recordings. So, but there won't be any quantitative data. It will only be a descriptive account. Few remarks on the language. So it's a Bantu language, so it's a language with nominal classes. It was formerly considered as a dialect of Kiswahili in the 50s, but it's now considered as independent. It has a large part of lexicon that comes from Arabic and also from French more recently. And one interesting feature is that it has an augment which, contrary to what is possible in other Bantu languages, really behaves like a definite article in Romance. It has a phrasal stress that I won't really discuss, but which falls on the penult of phrase, as in many Bantu languages. And it especially has a very interesting tone system. So you have an unbounded shift, meaning that a tone will shift on its right as far as possible. So if you have a word like drunkard, for instance, where you have a high tone on the final syllable, if you have afterwards a word that has a high tone on the second syllable, then the tone will shift on the following one. But if the lexical tone, so 2 here has a lexical tone on the final syllable, then the tone of drunkard will shift on the second syllable, because it can, okay? But it won't move if there is a lexical tone just afterwards. So this tone shift, combines with the deletion of every even number tone. So you have an alternation. You will keep the first tone, the third tone, and the 5th tone, but not the second and the 4th. So for instance, if you compare 6 and 7 here, the first tone, the tone of the verb, awono, I saw, shift up to the following word and stops on the penult because there is a lexical tone at the end of drunkard. This one thus deletes. And then the final tone, the one of 2, will be able to emerge. But if you have a noun that has 2 lexical tones, then the tone of the verb stops on the first, this one is deleted, then this one can emerge, will appear then on the adjective to, and then the final tone will not be expressed. So there are many other things to say about the prosody. Just in a nutshell, this tone shift phenomenon I just discussed is a clue for major phonological phrase boundaries. In some dialects, or at least in some speakers, I do not have enough speakers to be clear on this subject. There is a clue for minor phonological phrase, which is the insertion of intone on the penult of small phrases. I will discuss it later. A high boundary tone signals the end of a non-final intonational phrase. A final intonational phrase is signaled by a low boundary tone. Every tone in an intonational phrase is downstepped in regard to the preceding ones, and the system is slowly evolving towards a pitch accent system. It's losing its tones currently, so it leads to some complications that I will not be able to discuss. So, okay. So now turning to optimal domains theory. Here is a quote from Kasimji and Kisber's paper in 1998. And what they say is that just as segments are organized into domains, features are also organized into domains. And as I said before, just as a segment that is not in a domain cannot be pronounced, so it is a case for a feature. So the domain licenses the feature, so to speak. So you have a representation in 8. You see that you have the element that is lexically assigned with the feature, which is called the sponsor. And you have a domain of expression of this feature, and the head depends on the direction of the extension of the domain. So here in this case, the domain extends on the right, so the head is the last element of this expansion to the right. But the domain is a full element. So if we come back to Shingaseja, if we take just a small sentence, he saw or she saw a drunkard, you see that the tone shifts here, and then the other one is deleted. So the idea is that you have a high tone domain that expands to its right, with the head being the only syllable where the feature is expressed, and the domain that will be associated with the second tone is deleted. So it's a framework that is inside the optimality theory. I will not discuss it extensively. Those who are interested, we can talk about it later, but you do not have to master optimality theory to understand what I will say just afterwards. Just a few insights for the other people. So you see that you have various candidates that presents all the possibilities, and you have various constraints that will have an impact on the length of the domain, on the fact that you will have or not all the syllables in a domain that will express the feature. And you have constraints such as non-adjacent edges that will prevent the co-occurrence of two domains. That is equivalent of some OCP constraints. So why would it be interesting to use domains in comparison with other frameworks such as autosegmental theory? So as you understood, it's really interesting for long distance phenomena, such as unbounded shifting or spreading. And you have some other advantages. Just a small example, depressor consonants. So if you take a language like Shikauma, it's a Mijikenda language from Kenya, you see that in I change, you have no high tone, but in she changes, you have a high tone that spreads, sorry, up to the penult. There is a kind of non-finality effect. But what is interesting is that G is a depressor consonant, so it will lower the following syllable, the following, vowel. And it's highly problematic in an autosegmental perspective because it violates no crossing principle. If you have a high tone that is associated to a first vowel and to the third vowel, and a low tone that is associated to the intermediate vowel, it's highly problematic. So usually you have to adopt some kind of ad hoc system like a fission of tones or something like that. With a domain perspective, it's easier because you can add a specific constraint. Here is the one that has been created by Kasimji for your local event, even if the domain extends around these elements. So we can discuss, of course, the fact that this constraint is ad hoc or not, but the idea is interesting. So why did optimal domain theory remain quite unsuccessful these last years? First, it's not easy to guess if it's really compatible with language that have multiple tones. And it's also very problematic for some phenomena such as non-automatic downstep. So downstep that is created by a floating low tone, for instance. And of course, as for any theoretical idea like this, we can also question the psychological reality of the elements. Okay, so now let's turn to the interaction of tones and intonation or subjects. I will discuss several very small phenomena of Shingasija just to illustrate the various possibilities. First, a very basic situation. You have an intonation tone that is not associated with a lexical tone. So very small example. So in Shingasija, you have you have a lexical high tone on the first element here, a second high tone on the root, and of course then the tone of the root is deleted. And then what you have is it's more clear on the bottom example from the speaker from the north. You have a low boundary tone that is associated with final lowering. You can see also that voice quality is affected in this case. So here it's quite easy to account in both perspectives. So you will have your lexical tone on one tier, and you will have your intone, your intonational tone, that is on another tier that will be associated to a syllable. So there is no low lexical tone in Shingasija, so the association is direct, so it's not problematic. For nodity perspective, you will have a high tone domain that is associated to the first element. The second sponsor won't have a domain associated to it, and so you will create a domain that I will just say is a low boundary tone domain. It's not really important for what I want to say today, which will be associated to a sponsor and which will express the feature on it. You can also have insertion of elements in a Toby-like perspective that are not boundary tones. So, for instance, in some varieties of Shingasija, you have I star intone that is associated to any minus phonological phrase that does not contain any lexical tone. So, for instance, in this sequence, the nice heavy elephants, a very spontaneous sentence, you will have a noun that has no lexical tone, and two adjectives that also have no lexical tone. And in this situation, in Moroni or Washili, not in the north, you will have very little rising of the F0 on the penults, on the stressed syllables. So you have the pitch track here, and so you see that you will have something like Zendovunje man 0. Okay, with little rising or something that is not falling, as it will be the case if there was no H star here. So here also it's quite easy to express in both systems. You will have all the intones on a tier that will be associated, and you will also express the domains. You will use various constraints, alignment constraints to the stressed syllables, and constraints that are saying that the domain has to be restricted to monosyllable. Okay, now more interestingly, what happens when you have a combination of tone and intonation? So here is another example. So if you have only one tone on the final syllable, how does it combine to the Bandari tones? And here it's interesting because you have a difference between the dialects of the middle part of the island and the varieties of the northern part of the island. In the middle part of the island, what you will have is that the high tone will be lowered by the low Bandari tone. So just as in Belzung and colleagues work on Boshi. But in the northern part, as you can see, the high tone exhibits a small rise. So there is no evidence for any low tone. In fact, in the north, the high tones will dominate the intonational tone. So it's not easy to know if there is a Bandari tone that is dismissed or if there is no Bandari tone at all in this situation, of course. Let's adopt this second perspective. So in a noto-segmental framework, you will consider that the low Bandari tone associates to the lexical tone, and then the output will be the combination of the association of these two elements. That's exactly what Belzung and colleagues, Rouillet and everybody said. In domain, you will just consider that you have two different domains, the lexical tone domains and the intonational domain. So it's very important to say that I do not assume that the lexical tone domain is included in the intonation domain. They are just aligned to each other. What happens when you're going to the north? So in this case, you will have to posit for Moroni, for the north, rule or constraints that prevent the association of a Bandari tone to a lexical tone. Maybe not delete the association, maybe just saying that the association is not possible on lexical tone. As for domain approach, you have various possibilities, such as the idea that you do not have overlapping of domains, or you cannot have two different sponsors. There are various possibilities that I won't address. Okay, for this section, a last example with a high Bandari tone in Shingazija. So as I said, it align with the end of any non-final intonational phrase, except when the sentence is short. There are some eurythmic constraints. So here is an example. The drunkards who marry so are going swimming. So the tone of drunkard shifts to marry. That's interesting for Shin. There is no boundary separating drunkard from marry. Then the tone of Mary is not expressed, so the one of the relative verb is expressed and shift to the end of the phonological phrase and then the intonational phrase. So you see that in such a situation, we do not have a down step of the last tone, but the tone is raised at the same level usually, or sometimes higher than the previous lexical tone. So this is the main evidence, the absence of down step, of the presence of this high boundary tone. Now, interestingly, the boundary tone is not inserted on the final syllable of the intonational phrase, but it's rather raising of the final high tone. So if I change the first noun for a noun that has two tones, so the first one shifts and is blocked by the second, then the one of Mary can emerge and will shift on the syllable wa. And in this case, the tone of the root of the verb will be deleted. So we would have expressed, we would expect, sorry, super high or high boundary on this syllable, but then it will be on the preceding one. So you see it here. We do not have the raising on the syllable now, but it's on the previous high tone. So it was, again, what Belzung and colleagues found for Boshi. It's also true for Chimuini, for instance, and other languages. So here, in such a situation, you will need a rule in an autosegmental framework that will target, that where the boundary tone will target the lexical high. And it's quite easy to implement. In domain analysis, so it's maybe a bit messy here to see, but it's not that complicated. So you have two lexical high domains, and then you will have the high boundary tone domains that will be aligned with the head of the final lexical tone domain. And then you will have a constraint that says that this domain has to be monosyllabic once again. Okay, so in many situations, most of situations, both the accounts works quite well and even made some similar assumptions. So like this latter example, you will be able to account for them with one or the other situation. And in the next section, I will discuss an interesting case study, yes/no questions in Shingazija. I will skip this one because I'm quite late. So yes/no questions are expressed by what I called a super high tone that surfaces on the penult of the utterance. So, for instance, if you compare 31 that is illustrated here and 32 that it is illustrated here, you see that awono lepa, she saw the cat, you will have a high tone that is in the end of the verb. Because of the augment, you have a boundary before, and then para is expressed by a downstepped high here. And if you compare with the question, did he saw the cat? So there is no difference on the morphologic or segmental sides. You see that you have a raising, a very sharp raising of the F0 in this situation. Okay. So in this case, in comparison with what happened with the relatives, it's not a raising of the high tone. Because if you take an example where the high tone is far from the end of the uterance, like here, she gave a heavy cooking pot, Anika Nyungun 0, so you see that the high is here and that everything falls. There is a smaller spreading of the tone. It's possible in some situation, but in any case, you do not have anything on the penult. Then in this situation, you still have a raising of the F0 on the penult. So now, why is it interesting? It's interesting because on the one hand, you do not have any effect of a preceding high tone, meaning that if the high tone is, instead of being way before or being on the penult, if it's just before the penult, everything works just as it was previously discussed, and meaning that you have a raising of the high. But if you have a final high tone, then in this case, the super I is displaced on the antepenult syllable. So you see that in 38, you do not have as expected awonom pira, but you will have something that awonom pira with raising of the antepenult. So this is quite hard to express with the autosegmental perspective. So it's not problematic for all the first examples, but it's highly problematic when you want to displace this I on previous syllables. So in 40, you have a high tone here, but you can have examples where the preceding lexical I is way before. So it's not raising of the previous I. The only thing I was able to think of is the idea that there is a kind of projection of the boundary tone on the lexical tone, but it's I do not see any reason why there will be such a projection, and even in this case, it's quite complicated. You have to suppose that there is a projection and that there is an OCP constraint that avoids the succession of this projection and the lexical, and then deletes the association, and then you have a reassociation to a preceding syllable. In a domain approach, it's more interesting because everything is on the same level. So you can imagine constraints where you won't have the succession of the boundary of an intonation tone with the boundary of a lexical tone, with constraints like OCP. Okay, I see I'm very late, so I'm sorry. So I will just be quick on the end, and I will skip part of it. Just quickly, one argument interesting on the idea that it's a domain is the fact that you have a plateau before, between the super high and the previous lexical high. So I will skip most of the end. Just in a nutshell, this idea, the idea that I just expressed, can be used for some other languages too. Here is an example from Zerbian on Tswana, a language of South Africa, Botswana, etc. You see that she gave examples where you have a low tone everywhere, a high tone on the penult, and high tone on the final. And what she discovered is that in such a situation, you have final lowering when you have only low tones, and but no final lowering when you have a high tone on the penult or on the final. And then she had to suppose that you have a low boundary tone when you have low tones, but that you have nothing that she labeled as zero boundary when you have high tones on the penult or on the final. And an idea will be to use something similar to what I said before, and that to use a constraint against the succession of boundary of a lexical high tone domain and a boundary of a intonation tone domain. Okay, I will stop here and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Cédric. Who is that? Yeah, so if you have a question, please send me your name and affiliation. So since there is no question, can we, at this point, can you go back briefly to the boundary condition and just like the final that you quickly skipped the analysis?
Which one?
A little bit more further back. Yeah. Yeah. So can you just walk us through like the boundaries that you are talking about? So the tonal domain boundaries and the phrasal boundaries are interacting in this analysis. Is that right?
In such a case, yes.
Yeah.
So the idea will be that when you have a high tone domain that is expressed on the final syllable, then in this case, the super high cannot be assigned to the penult one because it will result in the succession of the boundary of the intonation tone domain and the boundary of the lexical tone domain. So remind that this representation is that a way to present things, but I do not suppose that the high tone domain and the intone domain of the low boundary tone are that the boundary tone of the high tone is included in the boundary domain tone, boundary tone domain. Sorry. So then you have a contact between that. Then you have two syllables where one ended in when one is associated with the end of an intonation domain, and one is associated with the beginning of a tone domain. And when the when you consider the output, where you have the high tone, so the intonation high domain that is on the antepenult, then you avoid this contact between this domain and this one. So you'll have a specific constraint against that succession of this particular intone domain and this particular high tone domain.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. I think we have a few questions now. Ingo Feldhausen actually wrote the question here. I can repeat it, but Ingo, you can also say it. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Yes. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So actually now I have two questions. So my first question is the H star tone. I did not understand. I did not understand well whether this is a boundary tone or if it is a lexical. If it's a tone for lexical stress. Perhaps it was too fast for me in the beginning.
No, it's,
so the question behind it is, what kind of tone is it? Because it's not a, yeah.
So no, it's definitely not lexical tone. So that's sure. So there is no lexical tone at all. And if you have, for instance, if I had here in Moroni lexical high, the I will shift up to this one, and you will still have a small raising in this situation. So this raising here does not block the shift of a lexical tone. So it's definitely something from the intonation. So now I label it with I star, but I can perfectly understand that it's considered as something else. It was not clear to me to decide. I basically followed what is said for Swahili, which works in quite a similar way, and where it's labeled as this, actually. I don't know if I answered.
Okay, I see. I think I was just irritated by the star symbol, because coming from intonational languages, I directly have had a different conception in my mind. Okay, I see. Thank you.
Well, how would you would label it with a boundary?
Actually, I do not know, but I wanted to, because it has nothing to do with metrical stress of the word, right?
Yes,
like
it
we
has.
know it from.
Yes,
Yeah, it has.
It has because it's on the penult. So you have phrasal stress. So every phonological word is stressed on the penult, and then the penult of a phrase is has a stronger stress as the other. So
Okay, I see.
The penult, which is a stressed one.
Okay, I see. Thank you. So yeah, okay, okay. Now it makes sense for me. Okay, thank you.
No, sorry for the lack of clarity.
No, that's fine. Actually, Seunghun, yes. I have another question. Is it fine?
Can you wait?
If there are other questions,
Yeah.
I can wait. No problem.
Yes, yeah, you can come back and maybe you can answer it.
Yeah, no problem.
So, yeah. Let's give Shin Ishihara from Lund University as the next question first. Next question first.
Hello. Hi. So yeah, thank you. It's very puzzling data. It's very interesting. This representation is, I find that, I mean, it's not really a question. It's more like a comment. It's kind of interesting because when you have the domains, you can cross the domains, right? So and that makes it very difficult to sometimes parse the representation. But I mean, I'm just wondering, would it be possible to sort of combine the auto-segmental representation and then this domain representation in the sense that you can sort of represent it in two separate layers? I don't know if that but then you still have to account for this, clash between the curly bracket and then round bracket. But I wonder if there is any sort of implication if we assume that kind of layered analysis of some kind.
Actually, I don't know how many different it may, as you said, I still have to account for the interactions. But I suppose that it's possible with 2 layers in a different way. I don't know if it's, so for the representations, it may be more elegant and easy to follow for the people, because I know that.
Okay, so I also, a very quick question. Do you think it's this constraint is some type of OCP effect, or?
Yes, no, definitely. It's a kind of OCP effect. And I think it's the case in any way you consider it. The fact that you have this super high that is displaced when you have a high tone that is expressed, because something that I did not say is the fact that you will have this movement of the so-called super high tone only when the final tone is surfaces. So if you have an underlying high tone that does not surfaces for any reason, then in this case you won't have this displacement. So it's really an OCP effect, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from, yeah. The next question is from Nancy Kula, University of Essex.
Hi, Cédric. My question was a little bit maybe, I don't know, I thought when Seunghun started asking his question, I thought it was a bit similar. I don't really understand whether, like from a theoretical perspective, whether there is a definition of these domains. So it's kind of like what defines the domains? Are the domains defined independently, or is it the pattern of the tones that indicates what the domains are? So I'm just wondering whether, kind of like if it's the patterns of the, or even, you know, you had the nice example of the depressor consonants, where there was a domain where there was, part of it was the depressor consonant domain, and that's where we are going to have that. But then there was this syllable at the end, I think ka, which was outside of it. And it's just, it really made me think, what's determining what the domain is? So is it just where you have some activity, either the depressor or the high tones interacting, that is what defines the domain, and it's not something that we define independently theoretically?
Well, there are two dimensions of this question. Is that how do you define the domain on the feature level, and how do you define the domain on the length or alignment of the domain? So is your question on the first, the both?
Well, the both would be great, but especially the feature one.
Well, that's a good question, and that's something in fact, I do not really understand because when you go back to Kisber's works, so outside of tone, he works basically on the spreading of the nasal feature. But you do not have in the papers he wrote with Cole, with Farida and everybody on the kind of feature tree that is associated to this domain, and that's a limit of this framework. It's the fact that he never really discussed these questions. I do not have then a real answer to give to you, because I did not realize, I did not think of the consequences of this framework outside of the prosody on the whole features that can be associated to an element. As for the expansion of the domain, you have, I think, the same constraints as for any cases in phonology where you have a feature that is expanded outside of its lexical assignation. So you will have the same alignment constraints with prosodic elements or this kind of stuff. So but on the nature of the domain, it's a real question. And even if on the intonation, for instance, something I did not address was in the end, one interesting aspect of the idea of domain is that when you think about intonation in topic-like frameworks, it's very problematic to discuss of extended phenomena like a global raising of something. And sometimes you have labeled that like percentage Q raised or this kind of stuff. And it's really difficult to know what exactly is besides labeling. So the idea maybe that that the domain extends to a whole element, and you will have a full raising of some elements. But then the question is, how do you label this in comparison to an intone? So would it be something that is, how would you define it in a way? And I do not have any good answer to this. I don't know if it was a good answer to you, but I do not have a good answer.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cedric. I think we can continue the discussion after we formally end the question. First, let's formally end the session. Let's thank Cedric with reactions like clapping or multiple things. So, yeah. And yeah. So the event will be wrapped first, and I'd like to thank, as usual, the two assistants, Yukki Baldoria Wu and Miyu Iizuka, as well as the Liaison Institute assistant, Michinori Suzuki. This event was supported by shared budget of ICU Research Institutes and Institute for Educational Research and Service, as well as the Linguistic Lab at ICU. There's some announcement for future talks. The 2 weeks from now, on November 21st, we will have Nicole Dehaye from Université de Constance and Adam Chong from Queen Mary University of London, who will share the research. And the time will be the same, 5 p.m. Japan Standard Time. We also have a phonetic talk series going on in collaboration with Keio University. That will be on November 13, next Friday, in fact. And two presentations are scheduled, Oriana Kilburn-Ciron from Northwestern University and Samuel Tilson from Cornell University. More information, including titles and abstracts, can be found on the ICU-LINC website. Thank you all who participated in today's colloquium. We hope to see you on November 21st. The recording will now be stopped.